Philip II, who ruled France for over 30 years, entered history as a monarch whose personal actions often sparked controversy and legends. He declared his choice and married Ingeborg on the very day their wedding took place. However, soon after the solemn ceremony, he filed for a divorce. As a result, this woman's fate was forever intertwined with the perception of her as the rejected queen. Modern historians tend to view this fact from a different perspective and suggest that Philip's motives may have been far more scandalous than mere personal preference. This king, renowned not only for his political activities, but also for grand building projects in France, most notably the magnificent Louvre Palace, is often perceived in this way, as the one who will always be remembered as the French monarch who locked his wife away in a high tower. If this sounds like a fairy tale plot or medieval legend, it should be said that everything was far from idyllic. Ingeborg spent 20 very difficult years in captivity. His life was not filled with talking animals or long-haired heroines as in fairy tales, which could be the key to salvation. Philip was an extremely strict and resolute man, and he had a serious reason to avoid close contact with his wives. This was related to a dark secret he carried throughout his life, a secret he chose to keep even in his grave. He was born in Gassé, a town in northern France, on August 11, 1145, in the family of King Louis II and his third wife, Countess Adela of Champagne. For this royal family, having an heir was of great importance, and the king already had 4 children from 2 previous marriages. However, Philip was the first son born to Louis in this marriage. By that time, his father, King Louis, was over 45 and in poor health. Therefore, he was eager to secure the succession, and on November 1st, 1179, when Philip was only 14 years old, Archbishop William, known as the Iron Hands, proclaimed him King of France during a ceremony rich in symbolism and grandeur. At this time, Louis was already eager to tie his son's future to a remarkable lady named Isabella of Annoy, who was to become his bride. The most remarkable aspect of this union was the age of the young people. On the wedding day, Isabella was only 10 years old, and Philip was 14. It was a strategic and significant political marriage. The future bride's parents were noble, a count and countess, which gave this alliance a status of a respectable and legitimate connection. Moreover, Isabella contributed not only her honor, but also substantial territorial holdings, the county of Artois, which represented a significant part of the land. Part 2 of 8. This vast piece of land ultimately became very beneficial to France in both political and territorial terms. However, despite the wealth and status of the dowry, not everyone was satisfied with this marriage. Among them, Philip's mother, the Queen Mother, stood out. Moreover, Isabella, despite her young age, had her own plans and connections. According to some sources, at the age of just 1 year, she was already pledged to another man. Her father, the Count, was promised in marriage to Henry, not only Count of Champagne, but also a cousin of Adelaide, Philip's Queen Mother. Adelaide's mother was dissatisfied with losing this noble promise for her daughter, and amid this, family intrigues and gossip began to stir. She was far from pleased with many things happening around her. Among other concerns, she was deeply worried about Philip's situation. He did not seem worthy of being king at all. Likewise, all 3 of her paternal uncles, her father's brothers, believed that the idea of making young Louis king was far from the best option. They thought that Louis's weak and already ailing health prevented him from properly ruling the state, and that passing the throne to young Philip was a risky decision that could lead to serious consequences. Less than a year after Philip's accession, Louis died. Finally, the young king was allowed to implement his own ideas. For example, during his father's reign, relations with the Jews were quite friendly. His father even protected them. In contrast, Philip showed no warmth or sympathy towards them. Soon after ascending to the throne, he took decisive action. He seized all their lands and property, imposed on them the obligation to convert to Christianity, and abandon their religion. Just 2 years later, in 1818, the king went even further. He expelled all Jews from the lands under his control. Additionally, he desperately sought to build a market in Paris, which involved demolishing houses owned by Jews. However, these measures were not the most terrible part of Philip's policy of persecution against the Jews. The worst happened in a place called Brix, where nearly 100 Jews were burned alive. These horrific events revealed the true cruelty of the Pisk monarchy. Afterward, in 1822, he finally expelled all Jews from all lands controlled by the royal court. However, these actions were only part of his campaign to suppress and humiliate the peoples and religions other than his own. Philip's plans also included constructing a market in Paris. To do so, he decided to destroy the homes belonging to Jews to expand the city. Yet, even beyond this, the most terrible and brutal persecution he initiated was not solely related to these measures. His cruelty reached its peak in a series of terrifying pogroms, culminating in the death of nearly 100 Jews at the so-called Brix. They were burned alive there, marking one of the darkest and most tragic pages in the history of that period. When, on May 28, 1081, just a month after her wedding to Philip, Isabella ascended to the throne, she was only 14 years old. The king himself was not entirely pleased with this fact. He was dissatisfied because she had not yet produced an heir, neither a boy nor a girl. At that time, teenagers matured somewhat differently than today, and 14 was still considered quite young for marriage and conception. However, Philip had other reasons for his discontent. He was simultaneously waging war with Flanders and was extremely irritated by a fact that literally made him feel nauseous. It turned out that Isabella's father was supporting Flanders in the war against his kingdom, and he couldn't understand how his wife could have a father who openly sympathized with his enemies. This blatant rift with a close relative became the last straw for Philip. In his eyes, his wife became irresponsible. He thought she seemed frivolous and lacked dignity. So he decided to get rid of her. Isabella, however, learned about her husband's plan to banish her and realized that only something very decisive and radical could save her: to remain Queen of France, to be the woman occupying this prestigious and very important throne. Desperate, she devised a plan. Throwing aside her shoes, she dressed as a penitent and contrite woman, a so-called penitent, and entered the church. Her goal was to evoke sympathy from those around her, to make people believe that she was genuinely repentant and suffering for her sins. She hoped that, through this act, she could win the people's favor and protection, and perhaps take control of her fate in such a difficult situation. Leaving the queen in power and maintaining her through popular recognition, many wondered, do people really succumb to manipulation so easily? The answer, perhaps, was simple: yes. Soon after the queen gained the support of the people, a large crowd entered the palace and began loudly expressing their discontent, demanding that the king understand he could not simply reject Isabella and strip her of her rights. Inside the palace was Robert, Philip's uncle, one of those who initially opposed the marriage, and it was he who heard the loud hum of the outraged masses. Inspired by the situation, Robert began developing his own plan. He clearly understood that the numerous and furious crowd was too powerful to argue with, and therefore decided to prevent Philip from abandoning his fiancée. But Robert had his own motive, which he carefully concealed. He knew that losing Isabella would also mean ceding territory, the county of Artois. At that moment, her presence and her retention in the royal family became his most important goal. And with cleverness, the plan succeeded. Isabella was, at least for a time, kept safe. However, in order to secure his position, he needed to prove his value, and for that, a son was required, a successor to the throne. At the age of 17, in 1187, Isabella finally gave birth to an heir, a son named Louis, in honor of her grandfather. This child became a key element in strengthening her status as Queen of France. Nevertheless, family drama still persisted. In 1190, she bore again, this time twins. Unfortunately, the first baby died on the same day he was born, and the next day, Isabella herself died from severe complications after childbirth. Before she could recover from this shock, relatives and courtiers lost another newborn, a second boy, signifying yet another tragedy for the nation. During this time, Philip was in Normandy, where he was engaged with King Richard of England. Political events were unfolding rapidly, but the news of his wife's and children's deaths reached the king unexpectedly and had a profound impact on his decisions. In his grief, he quickly declared a truce and hastily returned to Paris to bury his wife. Funeral rites and brief ceremonies lasted about a week, after which Philip, seeking to soothe his heart, again headed north, to Normandy. 3 years later, after Isabella and her children's deaths, the question of marriage arose once more. This time, he chose a new wife, Ingeborg, the daughter and mother of a Danish king. At that time, such an alliance represented a vital political strategy. 20,000 marks, no small amount, and very significant for those times. However, it seemed that Philip himself was uncertain about his decisions. His behavior at the wedding indicated that he appeared to doubt whether he should even enter into this marriage. During the celebration after the ceremony, he looked unwell, his face pale, as if he still hadn't recovered from the psychological burden of recent events. He eagerly awaited the end of the ceremony. As soon as all formalities were complete, he took decisive action. Within minutes after the festivities, he sent his new wife to a monastery and headed straight to his father. His true goal was to put an end to his recently begun, only a few hours earlier, marriage. Naturally, Pope Clement III was shocked and bewildered when he asked Philip why he wanted for a divorce. Philip explained that his reason was that he and his wife had not completed the full sacramental union, meaning they had not consummated the marriage through the act of joining. Apparently, Philip wanted to sever the new ties, but his explanation seemed utterly absurd to the Pope. In contrast, Ingeborg of Denmark contested Philip's words, firmly asserting that both she and the king had already undergone the marriage sacrament, and their union was full and valid. In the end, the father made a decision. He decreed that Philip could not marry anyone else, as he already had a lawful wife recognized by the church. The father's response was unequivocal, clear, and firm. He ruled that Philip must remain faithful to his wife and could not have a new one. However, by that time, a new bride was already on the horizon for the king, 13-year-old Margaret, who had at that moment already left Geneva. Her father, William, Duke of Geneva, approved the marriage and personally traveled to Paris to escort his daughter. On their way there, however, a conflict erupted around the young girl. They were attacked by Count Thomas, the Count of Savoy. When this man first saw Maria, he immediately desired to possess her. He forcefully took the girl from her father and took her away to an unknown destination. Thus, poor Margaret was held captive by Thomas. But soon, this crude attempt to seize the girl resulted in an unexpected outcome. He fell in love with her, and before long, they united their lives in marriage. Together, they fathered 14 children and shared a long and happy family life. These times were completely different from modern ones, harsher and more brutal. In the meantime, Philip imprisoned Inab Borg, a little more than 3 years after the strange ceremony. Soon he found a new wife, and in June of the year 1219, married Agnes Morenska. However, according to church canon law and the Pope's directives, this meant that Philip already had 2 lawful wives, which was considered unacceptable. When the Pope learned of Philip's marriage to Agnes, he sternly condemned such an act and declared that it was contrary to church dogma. Yet Philip paid no attention to the papal prohibitions. He continued to live with Agnes as husband and wife, disregarding spiritual decrees. In 1296, when the Pope discovered that the king was entirely ignoring his demands and church laws, he took drastic action. He declared the French land under the strictest ecclesiastical censure, an interdict. This meant that all activities related to the state were under ban, and France was placed outside the church's jurisdiction. It was an extremely serious step. At that time, especially in a Catholic country, Ignoring the church and its authoritative decrees was considered a grave crime, capable of threatening the country's entire political and religious stability. After sending letters to Philip, the woman reported that her living conditions in the castle were extremely harsh. Her captors treated her despotic and cruelly. In her letters, she admitted that she even contemplated ending her life to escape her unyielding suffering. Instead of showing compassion and understanding support to his wife, she was simply moved to a high tower, where she received insufficient food and was not allowed to see visitors. Her safety and that of her children remained completely under control. She was locked away from the world. Philip and Agnes had 2 children, which caused even greater anger in the Pope, since all these babies were considered illegitimate. The head of the church went even further. He refused to bless Philip, effectively excommunicating him from the church. This step worried the king, and he promised to separate from Agnes, which was no longer just an empty promise but a fact. Their relationship was indeed severed. During this process of separation, Agnes mysteriously became pregnant with a 3rd child, which unfortunately ended with her death during childbirth. Philip insisted that the Pope recognize his children with Agnes as legitimate, hoping this would strengthen his position. In the 20th year of the 1000th century, the Pope agreed despite all political risks, understanding that such a decision would be advantageous for him. Now, the king remained with only one wife, but he still did not show genuine interest in her, and again asked the Pope to annul his marriage to Ingeborg. This time he explained his request by citing the need to dissolve the marriage due to alleged witchcraft. He claimed that Ingeborg had used magical rites, making their joint life and marital relations impossible. Even the Pope, who had previously seemed willing to support Philip, initially could not believe such fantasies. Ultimately, the king was bound to a woman he felt apathetic toward. At the same time, his true interest was in conquering the English throne. He understood that this path would be easier due to Ingeborg's connections to the Danish royal family. Despite the support sometimes provided by the Vatican, it often opposed him, and there came a time when the Pope needed the king's help himself. At that time, in Languedoc, there was a group of people whose lives were completely contrary to the teachings of the Catholic Church, which caused particular concern for the head of the Church. The Pope turned to Philip for help in dealing with them by any means he deemed necessary. However, Philip was offended by the Church's past opposition and did not hide his resentment. He remembered the times when the Vatican resisted his efforts, and in his anger, he decided to act decisively. Philip left behind a significant and vivid legacy that was woven into the fabric of French history, both spiritually and materially. His reign was marked by major reforms. He not only cared about the development of cities and infrastructure, but also laid a solid foundation for the country's future growth. For example, he personally established the foundations for street construction in Paris, which earned him recognition as a caring and foresighted leader from his contemporaries. Equally significant was the construction of the market square Les Halles, which became the center of trade and city life. When Philip became king, the construction of the famous Notre Dame Cathedral was already underway, and he showed perseverance in completing this majestic monument. In addition, under his leadership, the famous Louvre Palace was built, which is now known worldwide. Originally conceived as a fortress rather than an art gallery, this massive construction project played an important role not only in improving Paris, but also in establishing it as a major tourist destination, attracting travelers from all over the world. It was also during Philip's reign that the university charter was granted, elevating Paris to a new level as a center of knowledge and education. Under his rule, the city was regarded by contemporaries as the leading educational hub, often compared to Athens, the great ancient polis renowned for its scholars and philosophers. His contributions to agriculture were equally significant. He established the so-called vine fight, an annual competition among winemakers that greatly contributed to the development of France's wine industry and strengthened its reputation for producing red, white, and rosé wines. Perhaps the most notable and long-lasting change introduced by Philip was the redrawing of France's borders on the map. Before his reign, France occupied only a small part of the territory, roughly one-third of what it became afterward. Through his decisiveness and perseverance, he reclaimed control over lands that had long belonged to the English crown, specifically the northern regions near Lyon. This crucial step allowed France to access the sea in the north, which had immense strategic and economic importance for the country. There are also interesting stories concerning Philip's relationships with his women. Some historians have wondered why he displayed such persistent hostility or aloofness towards certain wives. In the 1966 drama The Lion in Winter, penned by James Goldman, it is suggested that the reason might have been rooted in the king's personal feelings. The play discusses the possibility that Philip and Richard the Lionheart, both main characters, could have had a romantic relationship. This hypothetical union, according to the scenario, might have served as a means to unite France and England through displays of closeness and trust, similar to modern photo shoots designed to craft a certain image. In 1222, after a serious illness and believing his destiny was sealed, Philip wrote his will. His condition continued to worsen by the summer of the following year. He struggled with high fever and weakness caused by the severe illness, which further highlighted his human vulnerability at moments when it seemed his reign was coming to an end. When he slightly recovered, he decided to travel to Paris to change the environment and distract himself from the painful symptoms. However, subsequent events took a tragic turn. He died during this journey, not reaching the age of 68. Before his death, he managed to speak with his son, future King Louis IV. In their final conversation, he offered his son advice, asking him to treat Ingeborg with kindness and attention, as it was his parting word. Thanks to these words, Ingeborg was able to find at least some peace, having endured numerous sufferings and deprivations during 20 years of imprisonment. Now, having become the legitimate Queen of France, she could peacefully spend the remaining years of her life free from shackles and persecution. Thank you for your attention to my story about the events of the past. If you're interested in discovering the most amazing and instructive facts related to history, continue to follow the updates. Don't forget to visit our main website, Fact Tate, where even more incredible stories and facts about everything in the world await you.